Well, thank you very much indeed, and it's a delight to be with you. In fact, when I hear that, I can't wait to hear what I've got to say, actually. So that's really very exciting. The topic of my session this morning is called Bye Bye Childhood. And as Wendy said, I'm the Chief Executive of the Mothers Union. I'm sorry, I'm just going to repeat a couple of bits she said because I'd forgotten that was in the biography. But we are a network in Mothers Union of about 4 million people in 83 countries of the world dedicated to making the world a better place for families. And we're very much passionate about promoting a society that values and protects children. Above all, we promote stable marriage, family life, and we believe in the protection of children because that, we know, will transform communities. And I'm sorry that's lost off the end of the slide for some reason. I think it didn't quite take, as they say. And so it's not that surprising that we started a campaign about 5 years ago called Bye Bye Childhood. And the educationalist of you with red pens, please note that's a deliberate spelling error, the way that's written. It's farewell to childhood, but it's also about the commercialization of childhood. Because we were concerned that childhood has become increasing, or children in particular, have become seen as a commercial target. That actually things are put into place that actually simply say we don't acknowledge children for just being children. We're much more interested in what they can buy, what they look like, and what they own. And that's a real concern for many, many of the parents that we encounter. We've been established for about 135 years as an organisation, and I suspect we're one of the earliest people who did parenting groups, because I don't suppose many of you go back quite as far as that in terms of doing parenting. But parenting was about acknowledging that being a parent is one of the most difficult jobs in the world. And actually, and it's one for which you get very little preparation. So over 135 years, we've encountered many, many parents who don't feel up to the task. And so we do our best to try and help people through that. But that commercial market, it's estimated about £99 billion a year in the UK and Ireland. And one that we know from parents who talk to us, it affects the values, the aspirations and the health of their children. And it's not through just things like broadcast media, but also non-broadcast media, in particular the online world. And also activity in the public space, not necessarily aimed at children, but certainly received by children. Not only is it a very heavily commercialized world, it's also a very heavily sexualized world, with children being bombarded with images of how they should look and things that they should own. And again, parents tell us that they've been aware of rises in stress, low self-esteem and anxiety with their children. So that campaign that I talked about, Bye Bye Childhood, we had 3 targets that we felt we would talk to. The first being parents, about giving parents the confidence to face up to and deal with these issues, to let them know they weren't on their own, as so many parents thought that they were. Secondly, we thought it was important to talk to the people who were themselves either selling things for children or responsible for marketing things to children, to try and awaken in them a sense of, was what they were doing the correct thing to do? And thirdly, we thought we ought to talk to parliamentarians, wherever they are, to alert them to the concerns of parents. And so perhaps for the first time in our history, some of our members got out and flash mobbed stores where they thought they were selling inappropriate items. And please listen to this, because yesterday we were talking about the things that were quite difficult for us to encounter, and Anthony this morning was saying things that I thought were so true. Do we simply get angry about things, or do we say, no, let's be positive and do something about it? So we were able to rally people, to get people to talk to their local retailers about lads mags and display of them, to get people to withdraw from sales some products that we thought, our parents thought, were inappropriate for their children, and also to deluge people in Parliament to say, this is really concerning to so many parents and children and young people. And that campaign to protect childhood as a time, not some idealized thing. And yesterday, I was so pleased to hear other speakers refer to it, that, you know, there was no idyllic past age of childhood. In fact, we treated children really badly. But actually, we're in danger of doing that again by treating children simply as a target market to aim at. And we found that many of the parents that we spoke to really were concerned about what their children were seeing. Over 80% of the parents that we spoke to said they were concerned about the sexualized content in media of all kinds seen by their children. And we decided we'd run one of those online petitions, and we did that with about 18,500 people signing up in 4.5 weeks, but calling for the government to take action to halt sexualized media aimed at or easily accessed by children. And that led us on, really, to a response from government. I had a phone call in my office to say, would I meet up with the Children and Families Minister, Sarah Tether, at that point, and also Steve Hilton, who was an advisor to the Prime Minister on strategy, the architect of the big society. And they asked me if I would be prepared to conduct an independent review into the commercialisation and sexualisation of childhood. And I said about that, I was A, very pleased to do it, and B, was very pleased that they were able to, that my Board of Trustees were able to give me 6 months to spend working on this as opposed to my normal role. In that time, I interviewed just over 1,000 parents, selected by geography, by age, and age of their own children, the number of children they had, and so on, across all socioeconomic groupings. We talked to about 70 or 80 different people in industry, ranging from people like Facebook, who were working with social networking sites. We talked to people like Tesco, Next, Asda, and so on, retailers of clothing to children, and so on. And a whole raft of different regulators, like the Advertising Standards Authority, and so forth. And the interesting thing that for me, the thing that I took most encouragement, was I also interviewed just under 600 children and young people aged between 9 and 17. And if ever you go away from a meeting like this feeling depressed about the future, I would say to you, go and talk, as many of you do, go and talk to our young people and ask them to tell you to share their hopes and aspirations for the future, because it lifts your spirit without ever getting you down. In particular, one of the things I was talking to a 9-year-old girl about the nature of pre-watershed television, and a long conversation with her. We were sitting having a Danish pastry and a coffee together, and she said, "I don't know why you grown-ups find it so difficult." She said, "At home we've got a remote control, a thing that we actually can change channels, and they're forever telling you, press the red button now, and you can access all the digital content." She said, "Why can't you simply fit a naughty button on them?" And she said, a button that if you see something that you don't like on television, you press it, and it registers with them to tell them you don't approve. Now, and then you could see this kid getting on a roll. And she said, "I'll tell you what, if more than 1,000 children press it, it shuts the BBC down entirely." I have to tell you that the funny thing was that the head of children's television was also present. Joe Godwin was present with me, and you could see the look on his face thinking, "I really hope he doesn't take her seriously." It was one of those lovely moments. But the approach that children take is so simple and commonsensical, and just a delight to be with. So what did we find when we talked to all of those people? The first was this, that actually that sexualized imagery, not necessarily aimed at children, but simply surrounds children. It surrounds all of us. It's become like the wallpaper of our lives, to the point where we no longer notice the wallpaper. But it is there, and it's having a subtle influence. And there were many, many parents who were concerned about the influence that was having on their children. The second real concern was clothing and services aimed at children that was inappropriate. I don't know if you can read this, but it says, I'm far too pretty to do homework, so my brother has to do it for me. That was widely available. Slogans on T-shirts was a real concern for parents. I'll touch on that a little later. The third was this, that children seen as consumers. Many, many parents assumed that, well, they firstly felt that there was a significant increase in activities aimed at marketing to children. And there were some that they thought they could cope with. So, for example, people thought that broadcast media, I can control what my children watch on television, I can control what they see in magazines or advertising, and I can sort of, to an extent, explain billboards. But actually, over the past few years, a significant tipping point has happened, which is if you look at the expenditure on marketing and advertising, there was a tipping point to where no longer is the broadcast media, things that as adults most of us are familiar with, no longer is that the majority. It's actually the online media that is now responsible for more than 50% of all advertising aimed at children. And, well, aimed at everyone, actually. But children in particular are therefore accessing much more through the medium of the internet. And that in itself then means parents have even less control over it. As it happens, I actually don't believe many parents have much control over broadcast media too, because parents sort of kid themselves that they know what their children are watching. But when you've got more than almost 60% of children having access to a television set in their bedroom, really parents don't really know what their children are watching. But nevertheless, that idea of children accessing material, the commercial imperative of things like social networking sites, driving information that parents are very unaware of. And the fourth area that we found that really was of concern to parents was the sense of how do you make your voice heard? So many parents that we spoke to said, well, if I complain about that, I'll be seen as a prude. And actually, the reality was that almost overwhelmingly, perhaps 99% of the parents we spoke to would call themselves as that definition, and they wouldn't be in the minority at all. There were many people who simply didn't want to speak up because they felt that it was generally acceptable, that the world around them was like that. And actually, it becomes very difficult to complain if you feel like that. And then the mechanism for complaint, too, is very difficult to do. So we found that, having got those sort of four key themes that were there were two approaches that we encountered. The first is this, what I would call wrap children in cotton wool approach. I'm sorry, they're not working the way they should be. Wrapping children in cotton wool approach was something that we encountered a great deal. In particular, it's often characterized by what I would call the tabloid press, who acts in a very hypocritical fashion. These are the people who will say, you know, it's a nasty world out there, we need to protect our children from it. And somehow, miraculously, when they're 18, they can be exposed to that world and somehow have the emotional resilience to deal with that world. And often, as I say, driven by very much a tabloidy approach. So, for example, people complaining about the X Factor final back in 2010, when there were two fairly raunchy acts from Christina Aguilera and Rihanna. In pre-Watershed time, massive family viewing. Many parents felt very uneasy about it, fanned by one of the tabloids who said, this is disgraceful, this is what our children are being exposed to. And by the way, if you missed it, here they are, digitally enhanced pictures for you to be shocked with us. A horrendous sort of approach to things. And then the other approach that I would say, these aren't coming out the way they should be at all, is the kids are media savvy. And that was a sort of, and I'm sad to say it, but I encountered that from a number of academics who said all kids are media savvy. I thought that was a sweeping generalization, not supported by evidence at all. Because I encountered many children who were media savvy, and many, many children who were absolutely, really not media savvy at all. And to make the assumption that all kids are media savvy, yes, it's a bad world out there, but kids are media savvy, all you need to do is give them media literacy training. And that's the school's responsibility. and that's all you need to do, and they'll cope with the world. Well, we didn't find that at all a convincing argument. And in the, there we go. It seemed to us, as we got deeper and deeper into this, that the issues raised by the commercialization and the sexualization of childhood have their roots very firmly in our adult culture. And actually, therefore, we need to look at our adult culture and to perhaps halt, put the brakes, if you like, on an unthinking drift towards an ever more commercialized and sexualized society. But we then needed to work to help children understand and resist the potential harms they face. And if, therefore, that leads you to the conclusion, if you want children to be children, then you need parents to be parents. You need to acknowledge that. And one has to accept that parents tend to go into panic mode. Yesterday I resisted the temptation to think, somebody else used "don't panic." I'm saying that many parents were panicking about what was happening. And parents need help. And what parents told us was they did not want a raft of legislation from government. That's what they didn't want. What they wanted was more of a sense of a level playing field, a sense in which everyone played their part. And so if you want children to be children, you need parents to be parents, and businesses, broadcasters, regulators all have a role in that. And that means, for example, it needs to become socially acceptable to make a complaint as a parent if you see something you don't really like. You need to accept our own ambivalence. So, for example, the number of parents who talk about things that are available on the internet and yet fail to put on the parental controls of the devices that their children have access to. Or the number of parents who tell us that they would buy an 18-rated video game and play it, this particularly dads, play it with their 11-year-old child as a way of bonding with them. The 3 best-selling 18-rated video games in the UK were Mortal Kombat, Call of Duty, which is a blood and guts, rightly rated 18. Why would you buy that to play with your child? Secondly, second most rated game is Grand Theft Auto, where you gain extra points for knocking down prostitutes with your car. And the third one is this Atavar-based game called Catherine, which is a sexually exploitative game designed to allow this Atavar to react to whatever your signals you're sending on screen. That's the third best-selling video game at an 18 rating. Why would anyone think that's an appropriate way to bond with their children? And then you might say, well, I would never do that, but then we're all rather fashion victims. How are we affected by fashion? What influence does that have on our children? So we came up with a number of themes that we felt we would like to see. The first is this: we said we'd like to see sexualized imagery in public spaces, on television, the internet, music videos, magazines, newspapers, and other places are in line with what parents find acceptable, and that public space becomes family friendly. It's interesting to hear people talking about play space, public space becoming child friendly, but what about all those places that aren't roads, like shopping malls and things? Are they really family friendly? And I made a number of recommendations. This is bound to come up scrambled, I suspect. But the first is this: to ensure that magazines and newspapers with sexualized images on their front covers are not in easy sight of children. Astonishingly, the Periodical Publishers Association had a planogram for newsagents at which the recommended display height for magazines like Loaded and Nuts and Maxim and so on is 1 to 1.2 meters above floor height. Think of the height of where children are and what they're seeing. The recommended sighting is next to puzzle books and comics. That seemed extraordinary to us because these are magazines that actually just a few years ago would have been seen as pornographic magazines and therefore cited on the top shelf, which is our recommendation. Or if you can't cite them on the top shelf, then they should be covered with a modesty board. To reduce the amount of on-street advertising containing sexualized imagery. This is actually a bus side ad from 2009. If you've got a son, a grandson, or anyone else that you know between the ages of 13 and 15, they'll certainly know this is Megan Fox, over whom a lot of young boys get very excited. To ensure that the content of pre-watershed television better reaches parents' expectations, and to introduce age ratings for music videos. The second thing of most concern to parents was the influence of music videos, particularly urban music, on their sons and their daughters. In particular, the number of mums who said, I'm really worried about the way my son now treats his sisters. He's absolutely addicted to some of the rapping, and as you will well know, if you watch any of those sort of urban-type music videos, very often the role is one of a sexually dominant male and sexually submissive and willingly available females. And it's sending a very clear signal, which parents are picking up and are concerned about. And astonishingly, music videos aren't rated in the same way that either cinema or video games are. I don't think that's for any particular reason. It was just at the time the Video Recordings Acts were produced, music videos didn't really exist in any form that we would recognize them today. To make it easier for parents to block adult and age-restricted material on the internet. And then we would move from there to saying we wanted to see that retailers wouldn't sell or market inappropriate clothing, products or services to children. And that we wanted to see the regulations that protect children from excessive commercial pressures are absolutely comprehensive and effective across all different types of media, and again in line with parental expectations. And there were, I'm not going to go through all of those, but a whole series of recommendations that relate to that. What I also wanted was to see a point where parents would find it a lot easier to voice their concerns so that they're listened to more readily when they do express a concern and have their concerns visibly acted on by businesses and regulators and retailers. And so I recommended there be transparency in the regulatory framework, and secondly, it would be easier to complain through a single website portal to regulators, that you weren't expected to know what the regulatory framework was. Astonishingly, for example, if you were to buy a magazine like Bliss magazine, which seems to be targeted at 15 to 16-year-old girls, but actually is read in the main by 11 to 14-year-old girls, but has, for example, an extremely adult problem page on it. And many parents who buy it think it, for the age range, are buying it and then finding that they don't actually like the content. Now, astonishingly, you don't go to the Press Complaints Permission, you don't go to the Periodical Publishers Association. You're supposed to go to TMAP, which is the Teenage Magazine Arbitration Panel, because if a magazine has more than 35% of its readership being below the mean age of who it's aimed at in its media pack, you go to TMAP. That's really clear, and most of us would know that, wouldn't they? When I spoke to TMAP, they said, we haven't had a single complaint in 2 years. I'm not surprised, because nobody I knew had ever heard of TMAP, much less been able to deal with any of that. So, and then I finally wanted to say, and this is perhaps not my naivety, it's my cynicism of dealing with politicians, that actually what I do was do this review for everybody, and they would say, thank you very much, Reg, and we'll put it on the shelf. So I was saying that we needed to revisit this in 18 months and see what progress had been made. I have to tell you that when I presented those recommendations to government, I sat with the Prime Minister and he said, I want to tell you this, Reg, I accept all of your recommendations. Good. And he said, but I have a reservation. And it concerns the last one. And I thought, here we go. And he said, no, he said, 18 months is far too long. Let's give people 6 months to do something about it. Then we'll look again in 6 months, and in 18 months I'll ask you to do a formal review again. It's very interesting because actually none of this was ever a party political issue. I was asked by the coalition, which is the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative Party, to do it, but I also spoke to the Labour Party, to the Scottish Nationalists, to members of the Welsh Assembly and so on. Every one of them was positive about doing this review and implementing the outcomes. And the interesting thing was, I never once heard someone say, well, speaking as a Conservative or speaking as a member of the Labour Party, I think this. What I heard over and over again was speaking as a mum or speaking as a dad. And I heard that over and over again, and it was enormously influential in, I think, the way government reacted to this. So I'm going to move on, if I may, quickly to say what's happened to date. Well, I'm going to give a green traffic light to 9 of the recommendations which have been, in my view, implemented there or thereabouts. The first is that there's a new code for outdoor advertising. That was published by the ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority, and it was based on the idea that they would start to talk to parents as opposed to the general public. The general public, I'm sure, at the time that that advertising regulation was set up, a panel of people to assess whether advertising was appropriate was set up on the basis of the general public. And my feeling was that I suspected that if you were to have asked at the time that was set up, a general public and a panel made up of parents, they would have been very much in line with one another. But I suspected over time what the general public would expect has changed, and that the if you like, the acceptability of things have moved to here, but parents hadn't. And the reason I give for that is that so many couples that I spoke to said this. They said, well, you know, when we were a couple, we'd have seen that, and we wouldn't have been that bothered. But now we're parents, we think this. And that's quite an interesting observation, that their attitudes have changed because they were beginning to see things as children were beginning to see the world around them. And I think that was quite interesting. So I suggested that the ASA went out and recruited a parents' panel. And it's very interesting. They did so, and they issued a new code of practice. Now, this is an ad for opium by Yves Saint Laurent. This is a bus-side ad starring Sophie Dahl from 2009. That would have been acceptable under the old rules. And I'm pleased to say that at the end of 2011, the ASA, having done that research, came out with a new set of guidelines. And this is, I apologise for the quality because I took this with my phone as a bus went past me in Westminster. It's actually a campaign yeah, you should see the look you get when you're taking pictures of bus sides. People looking at you as though you're rather sad. But this is a picture of a Marks and Spencer's lingerie campaign, which was on bus sides in the run-up to Christmas last year. It lasted a day and a half before the ASA saw it and ruled against it, and it had to be withdrawn at a cost of £650,000 to Marks and Spencer's. This is an ad for Lola perfume by Coty. If you recognise the girl, she's Dakota Fanning. She is now 17 years old. She was 16 at the time the photograph was taken. The brief to the advertising agency was make her look around 13. So they dressed her in a dress which is from a well-known retailer aimed at the maximum age is 14, and sat her on a bed with the perfume between her legs. Again, that lasted a day and a half before the ASA forced the withdrawal of that. And another very well-known campaign, Lynx, the cleaner you are, the dirtier you get. This was a poster, press and television campaign. Lynx toiletries, by the way, the target market for that is 12 to 15-year-old boys. I'm sorry if those of you who are men who are still using Lynx deodorant, you're a bit out of time. But actually, that again was ruled as unexceptionally sexualized, with full of innuendo that was inappropriate for the target, and so was forced to be withdrawn at a cost of £1.7 million. So it's having teeth, and it's causing things there. And actually, a recent piece of research we did with another 1,000 parents, just in the run-up to the 18-month period, shows that actually parents are much more happy about what they're now seeing in the public space. Retailers issued a new code of practice. So products like this, I Love Rich Boys, which were that's aimed at 9 to 11. The sizing for that is 9 to 11. Now would have been withdrawn. The interesting thing is this took no government intervention. What this took was goodwill from retailers. I had a conversation with one particular retailer, I'm not going to name them, but they were selling a set of pyjamas for, it was aimed actually at 8 to 10-year-old girls. A little pair of gingham pull-on sort of elasticated trousers and an orange t-shirt top, which matched the gingham, which in itself would be no problem. But embroidered across the top was in gold, a gold star, and it said, "Future Porn Star." Now, that was sold by a major retailer, and when I called that particular trading director and the chairman of that company in to see me in the review, I had a conversation and I said, is this the sort of product that you know, this is a product that you're selling? And the buyer, who was a woman aged 35 with 2 children of her own, she told me. And she said, yeah, that's right, we sell that. It's a good seller. Nice little earner was the phrase she used. All right. And I said, did you have any feelings about whether that was an appropriate thing to sell? And she said, well, people buy it, which was interesting in itself. And she said, but we make a really good margin on that. So I sort of pushed her a bit, and I said, would you let your own children wear it? And it was like a Homer Simpson, duh. Why would I let my kids wear that? Which I found quite an interesting response. And I said, so why did you do it? And she said, well, really, all I'm charged with is the gross margin I make. And if I have to leave my ethics at the door, I do so. Now, I found that an astonishing statement. I have to tell you, her chairman found that an astonishing statement. He was looking dumbfounded, realizing when you're in a hole, stop digging. And he said, if there are no questions, we've got a bit of thinking to do. And at which point they left. Now, that was, I wouldn't say that was typical, but actually what amazed me was in conversation with retailers, very often they did not seem to make a connection between what they as a parent would do, and the majority of people who are buying this stuff are women in their mid-30s to early 40s, with children, generally speaking. And yet they didn't seem to make that connection, which I found quite astonishing in some senses. Now, the interesting thing was, the reaction from people I was talking to at the time was saying, should we draw up some regulation and push that through to government? And my instinct was to say no. Now, I'll tell you why my instincts say that. Before I joined the Mothers Union, I used to run a series of food companies. That's the majority of my working life was spent in the food industry trying to turn around ailing businesses. And what I used to hate was the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, as it then was, coming out with a new set of regulations which they'd say, you've got to comply with this. Do you know what my reaction was every time? I would go to our company lawyers and say, how do I work up to this regulation or work around it? And I'd spend a lot of time and energy seeing what we could do to get around it or to cope with it. Instead of which, if they'd have come to me and said, this is the problem we see, would you work with us on it? I'd have been altogether put the energies and all those legal bills into sorting it out. So this time I said to the retailers, could we get you all together? And the British Retail Consortium, bless them, pulled together people who fight tooth and nail, who represented 90% of the industry selling clothing to children. They pulled them together into a series of 3 one-day workshops, and together they came up with a code of practice. Now, the interesting thing was, I had got in my mind what I thought that code of practice should look like. They came up with a code of practice that was 15 times tighter than anything I'd have recommended, covering everything from the naturalism within photography, for example. Do you employ people who normally work with adult models, who then start to say to kids, pout, don't smile, stick your hip out, things like that. Absolutely covered everything. They launched that code of practice a week after I did the review, and the discipline of the retail trade is such that within a week it had been fully implemented. And you simply do not see those inappropriate slogans on things. You don't see thongs for 6-year-olds. And actually somebody mentioned yesterday about padded bras for 6 and 7-year-olds. I think actually that was one of the things that seemed to wind parents up. But actually we found no real evidence that that was a real issue. Actually, the majority of the things that were told to us as padded bras were actually training bras that were designed to protect modesty. They were lightly foamed in order to protect modesty. They weren't, it was the tabloid press who pushed that up into saying, this is disgraceful, this is being peddled to our kids. And they were lightly padded, and there was no evidence. I mean, I know Philip mentioned yesterday, I think it was in Australia, but certainly the foamed bras that were highlighted in the tabloid press here were for young girls aged 9 and above who were beginning to develop and actually wanted something that protected their modesty. So encouraging, I would say, is to see that retail code of practice. The third is the response from the advertising industry, where they have, again, created the idea of a children's panel that starts to look very hard at how you advertise to children and what you should do. And they've made a consistent definition for the first time on what constitutes a child. And they've also instituted a ban on brand ambassadors and peer-to-peer advertising, which was one of the most, if you like, stealthy forms of marketing to children. And you cannot simply do that under the age of 16. The second is the sixth recommendation, completely filled, is the launch of ParentPort, which is a one-stop shop for parents to express their voice. You'll see in the middle of that it says complain. If you click on that campaign, it's like a triage system. You can say what you've seen that you didn't like. You don't need to work out where it goes, and it's a triage system which sends the complaint to the right person. And what's more, you get feedback on it. It's now accounting for, I think, something like 40% of all the complaints that go through on inappropriate commercialization, and in particular sexualization in the media. It's becoming 40% of complaints are directed through that. And now we've just done some more work on that, so that actually now there are regular parenting tips on there to build up parents' confidence. So it makes it easy for parents to express their views. When it comes to the internet, we've got through this whole purpose of active choice or family-friendly parental controls. And that means that when you set up a new system, either a new ISP like BT or Sky or Virgin, or you buy a new device, you cannot avoid having a conversation about whether you set the parental controls. So if you went, for example, you set up a new contract with TalkTalk, when you first turn it on, a box comes up and says, do you want to turn on a virus checker? And almost everybody will say yes. So the little button is already clicked and people then say yes. And it says, is there anybody under the age of 18 in the household? And if you've got children in there, you can click on yes. Now, actually what we know is that often the behavior is such that devices particularly are bought by the parents, but then actually set up by the children. So most children, young people, want to say no. And actually, what it then does is say, would you kindly enter the 4-digit code from the bill payer's device, which actually forces you into having... And what we wanted was parents not to have a false sense of security about the process, but to have a conversation with their children about not just the opportunities that the internet presents, but also the potential risks. But we still need to work better on age verification. And then for Ofcom, they have issued, again, a new set of watershed guidelines based on the creation of a parents' panel. I'm conscious of my time. So 4 recommendations partly implemented. The advertising industry produced a schools engagement and parents pack. That's got a very, very patchy take-up at the moment. But it does start to engage with things like how you make media literacy work better. I want to go back to my 600 or 570 children that we talked to. And one of those girls, she was a 15-year-old girl, and she's talking about media literacy training. She said, oh yeah, we do media literacy in schools. I do biology in schools too, she said. And those of you who are biochemists will forgive me. She said, when we do biology, she said, what I learn is this. I learn that if I'm dancing around in my bare feet in the sitting room and I stand on a drawing pin, a signal goes up. Forgive me, those of you biology teachers. A signal goes up my sympathetic nervous system to my brain, and then my parasympathetic nervous system sends a signal back down to contract the muscle at the back of my calf. And that's what I learn in biology. But it doesn't stop it hurting. Media literacy is like that, she says. I know that they show me a photograph of a model in a magazine. And I know that really she's a size 6, but they photoshopped her down to a size 0. I know that she's got zits, just like I've got. But they've cloned them out to give her a flawless complexion. She said, that's media literacy, but it doesn't stop it hurting. Now, I thought that was a really profound statement from a 14 going on 15-year-old, a really adult statement about the limitations of that. And so actually getting to grips with some of these things with schools and with parents. And we ourselves have been trying to give parents confidence by producing a booklet called Labelled for Life, which is about the long-term impacts if we don't deal with the commercial world as children. We've done a good job, I think, on lads mags, but it's not there yet. Most of the main grocery retailers have put in that place, but actually it's the small retailers that haven't done it. And I'm mobilising our members, and there's 88,000 of them in the UK. I mobilise them to get out and go into their retailers and say to them, you know, you're meant to display those on the top shelf or cover them over. Now, what I found was a lot of our members lacked confidence in doing that. So we've given them a little downloadable form that acts as a research sheet. And we said, put it on a clipboard and you walk in and you draw up what's there. And we know that what happens is the minute you do that, someone walks over and says, what are you doing? And they say, I'm doing that. And we give them a little explanation of what to say. And astonishing, it's giving them confidence. And I think so far I've had 7,000 of those forms back of people who've gone into their local retailers. I had a phone call from a woman in Tooting a few weeks ago, and she said, are you that bloke what's done that review? So I said, yes. And she said, I want to tell you this. She said, I went into my store, and my little girl said to me, what's this why is that woman sitting like that, Mum, on the front page of this magazine? And I went and spoke to the bloke, and I said, don't like the way you put that there. And she said, I was waiting to get a mouthful from him. And he said, madam, if you don't like it, I'll move them. Where would you like me to put them? She said, up the top with that porn stuff. And he said, I'll do that. So she said, I'm telling you this, it's a win. That's great. And we've got beginning to get annual reviews from the regulators, and we're beginning to work on quality assurance about that media and commercial literacy resources and education for children. One recommendation I think I give a red light to, and that is age ratings on music videos. Because actually, the government consulted on this. I think they're minded to remove the exemption. But actually, we need to make sure that that applies not just in hard copy music videos, but actually goes across the online streaming of videos. The data, the age rating needs to be included in there. So what now? Well, music videos need an international agreement, especially on web-based sites. We need to do something about age verification on the internet. We need to check up on implementation, and this is where consumer power comes into play. And we need to make sure that we keep abreast of new technology and its implication for commerce and children and young people. And in particular, we need to still keep giving confidence to parents. You notice I haven't involved schools in this. A load of people kept saying, this is the school's responsibility. I thought schools have got too much to do. And actually, fine, there are ways that we do need to access those children whose parents don't engage with this. But more often than that, we need to give confidence to parents to say, you need to do something about it. It astonishes me that most, and we talked about it yesterday with play areas, but you wouldn't dream of letting your 6-year-old go out into the street without teaching them rudiments of road safety. And yet somehow we're prepared to let our children go into the virtual world without any rules of the road or road safety there. And actually many parents duck the issue of talking about, for example, the impact of pornography with their children. And they use the excuse, I don't understand it, they understand the technology better than I do. Well, that's like the excuses that I know many, many parents had who didn't want to come on and talk to their children about issues like sex and relationships and so on. So giving confidence to them, because although we can put all the filters in place, we can put all those things in there to make the world a better place for our children. But ultimately, we need to create young, emotionally resilient children who can, because the best filter that you can put on is a child who recognizes what's appropriate to see and what's inappropriate to see. And if we do that, then actually we can let children truly be children. A minute over.